So in this video, we'll talk about some of the philosophical approaches people have taken to studying the mind, that is psychology. The first one we'll discuss is called structuralism. Wilhelm Wundt was the first, established the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in 1879, and as a result is sort of thought of as the father of psychology. He was originally trained in medicine and physiology, like a lot of the early psychologists were, and his first experiment involved a simple test of reaction time. Basically, how quickly after hearing a ball drop could a person respond by striking a telegraph key. And he believed that the goal of psychology really was to understand consciousness. He saw mental experience as kind of a hierarchy. Consciousness could be broken down into essential elements. So the idea was that the mind, according to Wundt, constructs perception, like the food I'm eating tastes good, out of building blocks made up of separate sensations, that is taste, vision, etc., as well as emotional responses. So in order to study this approach of structuralism and study mental experience, he used something called introspection. And introspection was interesting. It was just a careful self-examination and reporting of your conscious experience. So this is sort of the description phase that we talk about in our way of thinking about psychology. Remember, we talked about describing behavior, explaining behavior, predicting behavior, and controlling behavior. This was largely focused on describing. So you would present subjects with an object like this ball or a piece of fruit or something like this over here on the side, and then ask them to describe their impressions or perceptions of it. So what's the shape? What's the color? What's the texture? How does the object feel when it's touched? What does it smell like when you sniff it? And he then cataloged all those and broke them down into mental experiences. Broke them down into parts including sensations and perceptions and feelings, and he thought that by doing this, perhaps he could combine things and discover rules that determine how these elements sort of come together to produce experience. So this is a very kind of reductionistic approach, right? If we want to understand something big, we break it down into its component parts. And what sort of thought that the component parts were these things like sensations and perceptions and so on. He used this introspection, which was a personal observation of our own thoughts, so people would just tell them what they thought when they saw these things. And he would ignore what the object is, that is, whether it's a ball or a fruit, and said, tell us about your conscious experience of it. The problem with introspection is that it's difficult for others to confirm an individual's introspection, so it's very subjective. And typically, science is not subjective, as you know. In the last 30 years or so, there have been good methods to observe brain activity that have enabled psychologists to revisit some of these questions with greater objectivity and success. But that was sort of the idea behind structuralism and introspection. One of Wundt's students, Edward Titchener, expanded on his views to establish a theory of structuralism. And Titchener sort of suggested that the mind could be broken down into its smallest elements of mental experience. And this is, again, very reductionist, very similar to how people do things in chemistry, breaking things down into molecules and then into atoms and so forth. Now, there's an alternative to this called functionalism, and that is, it's an alternative to structuralism. This grew out largely in response to Darwin's Origin of Species book, as well as The Descent of Man, which came about in 1871. The idea behind functionalism is you view behavior as purposeful, and it exists to help us survive, right? There must be some reason that our behaviors evolved the way they did, and they probably wouldn't evolve the way they did exactly if they weren't key to survival. So they were very interested in understanding the functions that our behaviors provided. So in that sense, they studied why behavior and mental processes worked the way they do, and what consciousness could do for us rather than what it was made of. And they added all kinds of techniques beyond introspection. One of my favorite psychologists, William James, of course a psychologist from long ago, wrote a textbook called Principles of Psychology in 1890. And this really dominated the field of psychology for 50 years. And if you go back and look at some of his writings now, you'd be amazed at how much sort of psychological research he kind of anticipated. So structuralism came and went, but all sort of contemporary psychologists typically think of themselves as functionalists at heart. We're really interested in understanding what consciousness can do for us from a survival perspective, rather than just looking at its component parts. Sometime thereafter, between the 17th and 19th century, supernatural explanations for psychological disorders were replaced by scientific approaches. So it starts with kind of a medical model that there are physical causes and medical treatments for all kinds of psychological problems. Over time, it evolved into a psychological model that is abnormal behavior can result from life experiences leading to fear and anxiety, and Sigmund Freud was sort of an adherent to that second part. So Freud, again, who was originally a physician, bridged his medical training to his belief in the impact of life experiences on behavior and came up with this thing called the psychodynamic theory. And the psychodynamic theory really dominated psychological thinking for the first half of the 20th century. He combined ideas about the unconscious mind, the development of sexuality, how dreams work, and sort of the roots of abnormal behavior to influence not just psychology but culture in general. In fact, he's probably one of the few psychologists that you could name off the top of your head. He founded the study of personality, developed techniques for psychoanalysis for treating mental disorders, and popularized the use of psychological principles for explaining everyday behavior. So he had a big impact, is what I'm trying to say. On the other hand, despite this importance, there's good reason to criticize Freud on two major grounds. In particular, his theories were not grounded in empirical research at all. There's no data behind his theories. In fact, some of his theories are actually impossible to even test. And his views of humans were largely negative and overemphasized two things, sex and aggression. Now, clearly, sex and aggression are both important to human beings. However, to focus solely on those things and neglect some other important areas of human development is really kind of short-sighted. On the other hand, Freud was still the first person to acknowledge that behavior is deeply influenced by our unconscious thoughts, impulses, and desires, and that's really true. That is, we're not conscious of everything that goes on inside our heads. We wouldn't have the time or ability or cognitive resources to be conscious of everything that's going on inside our heads. And many unconscious drives are sexual or destructive in nature, that is, have something to do with sex or aggression. I'm going to hold off here. So I'm going to go back to dynamic theory. We'll finish here, and I'll start a new video for behaviorism and a couple other sort of philosophical roots.